when he was a kid, to the Rutland Library for I believe this is our final talk on 3 lawsuits. Local historian Dave Libby will be presenting the talk. This is all in conjunction with the Smithsonian Institute and their museum that they have been so gracious to loan to us for 6 weeks. Yahoo! Because of the library, because of the 300th Anniversary Committee, and the funding from Mass Humanities, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and Big Y. And welcome to another interesting conversation.
Thank you, Carrie.
All right, thank you first of all for welcoming me. Carrie's very gracious in her introduction. If you're a historian, you may appreciate this. I personally don't believe you teach history. I believe you discover it. So it's a process of discovery. And today we're going to hopefully invite you to share part of that process. History, like many people's stories, is continually evolving, and your story opens up more broadly, more accurately, more clearly as you discover new things. And so it's a dynamic that you invite people into, and that's really the intent today. Is I'm inviting you into a process of discovery that I was invited here because I was researching inside the library, and I shared some things with one of the librarians about some of the local folks in Rutland, and that then led into this talk today. So there you go, thank you. And guys in the back, every once in a while, John McClintock. John is a close friend. I want to actually dedicate this particular talk to 3 people. John is one. John is helping to guide a process of writing this information down and putting it into a form that can be read. So John has taken the task of taking me to task in making sure that it gets done on paper, and he continually says, you need to make sure you write a book. So John is the first one I'd like to recognize. The second one is my mom, who's here. My mom's Betty Libby. She was the wife of my dad, who is the second longest standing minister of North Brookfield's Congregational Church. The longest standing minister was Reverend Snell. He was there 62 years. My dad was there 41 years. Reverend Snell started Amherst College, created the endowment for Williams College, and so effectively probably saved the college institution of America by creating a funding mechanism that then preserved it over time. So he's a signature guy. He's also an interesting guy in the relationship to what we'll talk about today, which is ends up in the abolitionist movement. Reverend Snell was the vice president of the abolitionist movement in Central Mass. The president was Reverend Fisk of New Braintree Church. And so what you see is that this issue has been significant since 1800 on forward. What we'll look at today is we'll look at this story that backs up the story of the 3 cases. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some information, starting with actually the bill of sale from Rutland for the slave Quack Walker. The final person I want to actually recognize is not here today, and that is Florence Pickens. Florence Pickens?
She's right here.
Florence Pickens.
Yeah. Wow.
So, maybe as much as anybody, Florence Pickens, thank you for coming out. I had a wonderful conversation with her son. Took her research, which extended through a lot of portions of her life, and made a play called Quack's Passage, which is being renamed into, let me make sure I get the word right, Quack's Passage, Quacku's Passage, my mistake. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I just want to make sure I talk about Florence for just a second. She researched this case extensively. And one of the things that's interesting is that while it gets credited for being in Barry, Barry was not incorporated until 1776 as Barry. Prior to that, it was the town of Hutchinson. in 1774. So all of Quock Walker's siblings and himself were born actually in Rutland. And so if you would like to have an email copy of all the documents that I'll send out and the things in this case, this is the first, I guess, exhibit, and it is an email sign up. So if you want to have an email basically of the talk today with all the exhibits that you can look at, at your leisure, that might be a way to digest the information, because it may be a little bit more significant to try to do that all at once. And if you like to, I will put this on this right there, and you can pass that around. And every once in a while, I'm going to give you some exhibits for those that like to, have some visual pictures of things going on. And so I'll hand those out as we go through the talk. And again, you can pass those around, and you can start with passing that around if you want to. And again, if you put that on the board, you can have, like I said, I've put this in an outline form, and you can see the outline right there. If you're a person who likes to follow a 5-point outline, there's 5 points on this. And then you can then sign up with an email. I'll send it to you. I'll send everything to Carrie so that she has it. Finally, the last thing I like to do is to pitch in honor of Florence and her son Sam the play Quackoos Passage, which is a rewrite of Quock Walker's story, or these 3 cases that were personified in a play that was presented about 15 years ago. And I heard it just a little while ago presented in a reading, and I thought the history was extraordinary. So I fortunately was able to meet Florence, or my mom met Florence, and then I was able to sit down with her son, had a wonderful conversation. It was obvious that they knew what they were talking about. And so I hope that Rutland, as an application from all this, might embrace the idea of being the presenter of the rewrite of Quackoos Passage. So, and hopefully we'll see that become something that celebrates Rutland's 300th anniversary. So let me introduce some of these other figures right here that you'll see. You see some illustrations. This is Mama Bet Freeman.
I know.
Okay, and so you'll see her. If you look her up on the web, you can find her story. We'll reference that today because it's significant to the 3 cases. This is William Cushing. He's the Superior Court judge that made the final decision that created what we call judicial review, which was a review on these 3 cases. But the 3 cases really start with the Quock Walker case. So when we look at the 3 cases, you can look and say there's 3 cases with inside the Quock Walker. We'll talk about those specifically. But there's also 3 major kinds of cases that went on with the Bet Freeman case, the Quock Walker case, and the William Cushing decision, which was a Superior Court case that referenced the Quock Walker case. So I have those set to kind of visualize some of that. And with that in mind, let me introduce the last person. That's the person behind me. This is an illustration that is, a personification of hopefully a happy image of who Quacko Walker might be. His name's Mamawi Andrew. He's actually a personal friend of mine. He's actually in Africa. And I thought that this was a very, very good picture of him. But also it had with some cages in the background, it actually kind of made sense from a metaphorical standpoint. But what I've learned is something that's very interesting through my friend Mamawi and through others in Africa that I work with daily, is that the process of naming children is something that seems to have not changed for at least 200 years in Africa. And if we understand that, very, very simple thing, then that might help us take the first steps as largely a white community that thinks differently than our African brothers and sisters, and thinks differently in terms of language. So when you name a child, the reason why they're renaming the play, Quackoos Passage, is because when you name a child in Africa, basically you're naming them with reference to what's going on in life. So Quacko means boy who was born on Wednesday. Okay? Watumbi, I have a friend named Watumbi Clinton. Watumbi means I was born to a single mom. Ochin means I was born in poverty. Okay? And so what happens in African naming of children is that they name them in the context of what's happening at that particular time in life. And why that's important is because you naturally then ask the question, if this is Kwaku, right, then where did he get the name Walker from? Okay? And so that becomes an apparent mystery, except that, you know, we have a character named Asa Walker that Kwaku apparently then took the name of in the process of this case. So the other part of an African naming process, Mamawi Andrew, is to name the child after somebody that you aspire to be. So with Toby Clinton is, I was born to a single mom, and I aspire to be like Bill Clinton. Ochin Reagan means I was born in poverty, and I aspire to be like Ronald Reagan. And so that process of naming children is very, very different than our English process of naming children with a sense of essentially a surname, David James Libby, and that surname then establishes a context of a property line and inheritance that extends not just through generations, but through all of history. Right? So the English process of naming is fundamentally different, and it leads to an understanding of property that's fundamentally different than the African process of naming. Okay? So that's the first thing I want to start with, is to understand that there's a very, very different way of thinking in the way that we actually communicate on a daily basis. The second thing is that when we look at the Native American, which would be the second kind of essentially group of people that we deal with in this subject today, the Native American thinks also differently. They think in terms of how the relationship to the world around them, creation, is taking place. So as they look at the language of the Native Americans, it interacts with the relationship around in the creation. When you look at an English naming process, we think about how we name through the context of inheritance. And when you think about an African naming process, they think about, okay, this is what's happening in life, and this is who I aspire to be like. Kwaku, 200 years ago, had that same process as my friends in Africa share today. And that stood out to me as something that was significant so that we can move forward with a better process of communication, which is, I would offer the core thing. The last thing I'm going to say is, and the last thing I want to kind of highlight, is I see that there's a lot of women here. This is probably a talk that gives a significant salute to the women of society as being principal influencers, because underneath this whole case, there's a couple key women who actually influence some very, very important parts that will bring this forward. And so what I want to do is I want to say thanks to all of you moms, all of you wives, because if we do a good job communicating, this will also help understand or help to relate how significant an influence that a wife is in particular. Okay, so with that, let me start by saying, first of all, that again, thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing this moment. And the Kwak Walker case, in summary, right, starts at a time when you had a slave in 1781 who decides to run away. By this point, it's in the town of Barry, which was formerly Rutland, and he leaves his master's house and he goes to a neighbor's house, and the master goes to recover him and beats him and takes him back. Right? This ensues a court case called the Kwak Walker cases. Now, the background to that story is that in 1753, Kwak Walker is born to a couple. The couple's named Mingo and Dinah, and they are owned by that bill of sale that's going around by a guy named James Caldwell, who is a resident of Rutland. Not only is Kwak Walker born in Rutland, but also all of his siblings, and he has 6, are also born in Rutland, because at that time, even Barry was the Northwest District of Rutland. So this case, from a significant standpoint, entirely originates out of Rutland. Right? Even though it gets played out in history, even though it looks at it like it's it's buried, or it looks like it's related to other things. It really has to do with the dynamics that were going on at that time in Rutland, and then also it has to do with the dynamics that were going on in the formation of this country. And so with that, let me try to back up a little bit and say, what was Rutland before it was Rutland, right? So in order to understand this, in order to understand even how slavery emerged as an issue in this country, right, we have to look at, and we have to look at some of the things that created the dynamic of the slave trade. And the first thing that created the dynamic of the slave trade would be an event called Pequot's War. Now this was a 1637 event. This is well before Rutland's here, okay? There's not even a concern for Rutland being here, right? So Pequot's War is an event where you have some basically Indians that came from largely the Mohawks and that ended up down by the Long Island Sound. I would offer that the main motivation was that they were tying up with the Dutch and creating wampum manufactured with the Dutch, and that was taking away from the beaver trade and the significance of the use of the beaver pelt as the dollar at that time. Okay, so I'm going to go and unpack that for you in a little bit. But to understand that what happened is that the colonials, which were pretty new to the area, were asked by the Wampanoags, which were down by Rhode Island, and the Narragansett, which are right next to where the Pequot were. They asked for their help to go and to attack the Pequot. Because of this, really it turns out to, it's a counterfeit issue. Okay? So they're creating new cash, and it's disrupting the economy, and the economy is already established. So what happens is that the colonials help them. They crush the Pequot, and then they take them to a place called Deer Island, and there they sell them into slavery, because you can actually sell a slave that is captured during war at that point. That was not just a common practice, but it became actually Massachusetts law in 1641. So the Pequot War motivated the process of conquering a group of Native Americans and then assembling them into a containing facility, and then this created a process of developing the slave trade in America. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you now some exhibits. My first set is, you can pass these around. These are A, B, C, and B, C, D, and E, and those basically are exhibits that would be included in that email. So you can look at them, peruse at them. But this basically looks at, these are support documents that are out there that you can discover in history. So Pequot's War created this event where the colonials at this time, who are trying to figure out how to basically survive, get this great idea. Let's take these Indians that we conquer and capture, let's put them into a containing facility, and then we're going to sell them down in the Caribbean, and we'll exchange them for African slaves. And so this creates the trade route, okay? Capture Indians, bring them down to the Caribbean, sell them for Africans. Africans now then have interest in Massachusetts. Massachusetts becomes the first colony of the colonies to legalize slavery. Okay? So what happens? Why did this happen? Why did this occur? Right? Now what I'm going to do is I want to give you hopefully a very brief overview, and this is going to be, again, this will be something I include, but a brief overview of kind of what happened to create Massachusetts. And this is, I'm going to roll down these dates. It may sound boring here, but let me kind of roll down this and so you get a big framework to understand. In 1498, John Cabot, right, basically explores the coasts of the east coast of America. So 1498, this is just after Columbus discovers America. Okay, we're being discovered up here. Okay. 1602, Bartholomew Gosnold names Cape Cod. Right? Why? Well, because of the cod. Okay, so now we have a fishing industry.
Never
Okay.
thought of it that way.
1614, Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame, he comes up to New England and names New England, right? Surveys the map. So 1614, this is well before the Pilgrims come here. 1614, this is already New England. Okay? 1615, Albany is created. Okay? Now, in 1585, what you also have is you have this trade route being established down the Hudson, which was up by the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it's establishing down to Long Island Sound. So when you think about the migration of Massachusetts, 1615 is your starting point. And it doesn't start east, it starts west. They're there 5 years before Plymouth Rock is. Okay? So already our history books are already skewed. Okay? But at least you can understand that there's an east version and there's a west version. And that plays out through history. Okay? So now in 1623, Gloucester is settled by a company called the Dorchester Company. In 1625, Boston is settled by a guy named William Blackstone. And he's kind of like the sole proprietor of Boston at the time. Okay, 1626, Gloucester is abandoned by the Dorchester Company, and the remaining members go with a guy named Roger Conant to relocate at Salem. In 1628, new investors, right, to this idea of hunting and fishing, furs and fish, they create a new company, right, called the New England Company for a plantation in Massachusetts Bay. So 1628, this new company is basically initiated by John Endicott, and he takes control of Salem and Dorchester. And incidentally, they end up taking over what was a very, very good native community, and Endicott actually renames it Salem and then basically pushes out all the Native American influences and makes this become a commercial interest. Okay? So then after that, what happens is that your 1629 Massachusetts Bay Colony charter is confirmed, and the New England Company is named to a Company of Massachusetts Bay in New England. Now, why is this significant, right? Why? This sounds normal to us now, but where did the name Massachusetts come from?
Indians.
Indians, right? So now what's happening is that you have a colony that's being named after the Indians, and you have a company that's being initiated underneath that same name. These are separate organizational entities. And so one of the things to understand in how slavery was initiated is it was the process of naming a colony the same thing as a company, and then that created the catalyst for extending that company's rights through court to take land to get slaves to facilitate the slave trade. Okay? So now let me continue on. 1630, the Great Puritan Migration comes. They remove Endicott. They replace him with, who's the first guy? Winthrop, John Winthrop. Okay? So John Winthrop becomes the president or the leader of the colony, the governor of the colony. Right? 1635, Roger Williams is banished from the colony, which is up by Salem. This is a different company to a different colony than the Plymouth colony. These are two separate entities at this point. Okay, so Plymouth and Salem are different things, and Salem has a company that's now essentially merging alongside of it. So 1636, he flees to Rhode Island, eventually creates Providence, eventually creates the refuge of Rhode Island. 1637, you have the Anne Hutchinson trial, right? 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is the first to legalize slavery. So this happens right after the Pequot War. So what happens is that the company realizes, all right, hey, wait a minute here. We just don't have fish, and we just don't have beaver. Now we can trade in human cargo. Okay? And so this revelation becomes an important economic mechanism that guides the rest of Massachusetts history. Okay? So then after that, 1642, Gloucester is taken over by the Massachusetts Bay Company, passes a law requiring children to be taught both in law and in religious practice. Okay? So then 1647, the legislature passes a law requiring all towns established to maintain public schools to teach religion and the process of the courts. 1648, the colony tries and executes an accused witch named Margaret Jones. 1652, there's a mint established in the colony, which violates its own charter. So they get the idea, I think, from the Pequot War. They see that they're establishing, fake wampum, which is an Indian wampum. It's Dutch and Pequot manufactured wampum. They say, hey, let's go. We got the coin, we got the control. So they, I believe, got that inspiration from the natives. 1659, Massachusetts Bay Colony bans Christmas. 1655, King Charles II sends a royal commission to New England to investigate the violations of the navigation of all these kinds of issues that are emerging. They dissolve or they discover the illegal mint and orders it to be shut down. The Massachusetts court refuses. Okay, so now one of the things that happened in the emergence of the Massachusetts Bay Company is that they decided to move all of their financial interests to Massachusetts and not have it stay in England, which is where the parent charter was. So they moved the company over to Massachusetts, and then they established a court under the colony that then gives them a jurisdictional right according to English law. But at the same time, they're violating English law. Okay, so 1675, you have King Philip's War, and we'll come back to this. King Charles II establishes a Lord of Trade to help regulate trade colonies. 1676, Edward Randolph creates a report on the many violations that Massachusetts is operating in, including an illegal mint and laws contradicting English law. The king says he'll allow the mint to stay open as long as you're printing his image, and they say basically, no, we're not going to do this, we're just going to keep our own money. Okay? So 1679, Randolph sent as a tax collector and a customs official. Now England's trying to keep their colony under control. 1681, Randolph informs the king of Massachusetts of many violations, so it's obviously not working. Okay, 1682, two agents arrive in London, but without the ability to revise any charter. So then, 1683, the king orders Massachusetts to try to revise or give their agents the ability to revise the charter. They refuse. 1684, the Massachusetts Bay Charter is revoked by England. So now, in 1684, largely speaking, they're an independent entity. They have a company here, they have a colony here, and they're basically telling England to go pound sand. Okay? So now you can kind of see why the revolution started in Massachusetts. 1686, the Dominion of New England is established. The colony is forced to merge with other colonies like Plymouth and the such, and that's why you have towns like Rutland, is because 1686 creates that signature event where land was allegedly sold, right? But that really was a process of the colonies now emerging, and you could say that the people are trying to figure out how to escape England, so they're going inland, and there's a motivation to try to make sure that you're going to create a new settlement. 1689, there's a Boston Revolt. The Dominion of New England is overthrown. 1691, there's a new charter. Now the colony is a province of Massachusetts Bay. And then 1688, King William's War begins. 1692, you have the Salem witch trials. 19 people are hung. 1693, you have the end of the trials. 1694, King William's War ends. Then 1702, Queen Anne's War with England and France begins. 1713, Queen Anne's War ends. 1744, King George's War breaks out. 1748, King George's War ends. 1763, the American Revolution begins. I think that's accurate. 1775, you got Lexington and Concord, which Rutland was well represented in. 1776, British evacuate Boston. 1780, Massachusetts officially becomes a state. This is now related to the Paul Barker case. In 1783, the Revolutionary War comes to an end to the Treaty of Paris. right? So that's how Massachusetts, basically on a summary scale, was formed, right? It was formed with the intention of a company, right, that had the name of a colony that was borrowing the name of an Indian, who likely didn't give it permission to be branded. So what happens, right? Well, to understand what happens in Rutland, you have to understand what happens in Brookfield. Okay, so Brookfield is the first frontier settlement of the New World. It means it's off water, so it's inland. But it doesn't get settled from the east, it actually gets settled from the west. And it gets settled by a guy named Pynchon. Okay, so when you look at, and you'll have one of the things going around is on William Pynchon. When you look at Massachusetts and you look at where the credit for Massachusetts really is due, Pynchon was the last really proprietor of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and is the only one who had any success. And he had success because he went out to where it was more developed on the Hudson River, and he established a Springfield in 1636. So what happens is that Pynchon, of the 12 essentially company owners, is the only one who's making any kind of money, and he's doing very well in the beaver trade, likely the fish trade. And when you think about the trade route that was being established, it was likely, if you think about up in Portland, Maine, you have a process of going from Portland to Portsmouth to Lowell to Lancaster to Brookfield to Springfield down the Hudson. That likely is a trade route that was being developed since the 1500s. So when you think about how this was emerging, this area here in central Mass was a portage place between trading that's been developing since the 1500s, and it was negotiating in beaver trade with the Indians. And so what Pynchon did, and what he believed, is that he believed that you should have equal relationships with the natives. And so thus Brookfield was formerly Quabog. The Quabog plantation was thought of as a place that would be kind of like neutral, where the interest of the church, right, represented with, Pynchon was a layman, the interest of the state, right, represented in the essentially the business, the representative of the natives, natural law, were all able to then congeal. And for most of the time, Brookfield is just that. If you go to a place called Foster Hill, on top of that, it's a very, very nice farm settled area. But it was for the natives, that was a celebratory place that likely congealed them after winter for about 20,000 years. Now, think about this for a second. We've existed for maybe under 500, right? And the natives were here migrating, right, in central Mass, in this area, from the areas like Hardwick and Barry, all the way down to what's called the Rockhouse Reservation. And so you'll see, if you go to the Rockhouse Reservation, you'll see burn marks on the walls that's at least 400 years old, maybe 4,000, maybe 14,000 years old, because it turns out that the Nipmunks, different than all the other tribes around, somehow, some way survived in central Mass over time. And when they were first discovered by the colonials coming in, looking to trade in furs and fish and humans, right, they found, or they claimed, that the Nipmunks were nomadic. In truth, they were migratory. They had a summer home and they had a winter home. And so they would go and winter together at the Rockhouse Reservation. They would lean, the things against the wall. They would, basically congeal there over winter, and then they would go back to all the water areas where they could then plant, corn and squash and hunt, and so that would then enable them to take and to fill what they had was called longhouses. That would be their places to resource food, and they would put their longhouses all over this area. So a lot of the area around here, when you look at things that had Native American villages and Native American interests, is they would have that signature of a longhouse, and it was in an area that was good for fishing and hunting and farming. Okay. When you look at the Homestead Act, okay, in the U.S., the Homestead Act was originated in Massachusetts under the idea that 160 acres was enough land to fish, hunt, and farm. Okay? But likely that concept originated with the Nipmuc. And so what they would do is that they would go out to their Rockhouse Reservation, then they would come back. And so what then happened is that you had this relationship that formed between the leader of the Wampanoag, Massasoit, right, where you get the name Massachusetts from. You have basically Massasoit. So you have the leader of the Wampanoag who would come out here, and this was, for him, being down by the Dartmouth, down in southern Mass now, or down by the Cape, this was kind of like a summer home. Okay? I believe personally that Massasoit is buried on Foster Hill, which then creates the catalyst for why King Philip's War emerged. So what happens with Pynchon, who's the only successful guy, is the guys out in Salem want to basically take over the company. And so you have a hostile takeover being managed. And the way that they manage it, first of all, is they initiate the first witch trial. It's actually not in Salem. It's actually against one of Pynchon's friends. And it's actually out in Springfield. And they accuse a guy of being a witch. Right? It's not a woman, it's actually a guy. So Pynchon ends up also being accused of heresy because he writes a book called like the Materius, what is it? My apologies. The
Meritorious?
That's the one. That's meritorious. He is the right thing. The meritorious cost of our salvation, right? And so he writes this book. This becomes the first book in Massachusetts to solicit a burning. So what they do basically is they accuse him of religious heresy, and they use that as a reason to chase him out of the country. So Pynchon ends up giving all of his resources to his son, helping this guy who's accused as a witch, and then heads back to England where he writes a number of other books, right? Massachusetts up in Salem gets this book burning, essentially event that looks at this idea, and underneath this idea is the idea of equality. It looks at this idea as being not able to be substantiated inside the context of what Salem is creating as a precedent, as a priority. Now, to understand that, you have to look back into England's history, and you have to look at the separatist movement and all those things. We won't have time to do that today, but that's to understand all that. You have to look back at what's happening in England at the time, and they're having their own civil war, and you have the king being, essentially tossed out. You have King Charles was executed, and Oliver Cromwell took over England. So you have now this time is a lot of people who are in England are separating from the crown and from the Anglican King's Church, which was initiated by Henry as essentially as an offshoot of the Catholic Church. And now you have a separatist movement that's starting up in Salem, and they're saying, wait a minute here, we're having our own kind of separate understanding of theology. And they're trying to establish its credential. They're using force to do so. And not to say that it was all force, but they're definitely using force to do so. So then what happens is that you have this incentive that is created inside of the Salem area to try to then take over the company, and they attack Pynchon. Pynchon goes back to England in about 1655. Then an event happens where that really starts to bring to the surface this issue. And that event is that Massasoit dies. Like I said, I believe he's actually buried on top of Foster Hill. And at that point, that's about 1662, 1661. They're not sure really about when he passed away. But at that point, you also have this initiation out of the East Coast that's looking to come west. Even though the West was founded and developed and initiated by Pynchon from Springfield, now the East Coast is saying, hey, we want to be able to take over the company, and we want to be able to then gain some land. Okay, so you have this event that emerges where people come about, in Brookfield they would say, the settlement of Brookfield started in 1665. Well, there's court cases of 1640 and 1637 that are already going on with the Quabog plantation, so it definitely didn't start in 1665. But when you're trying to establish a legal standing, right, you have to start somewhere. So what happens is that you have four guys who are basically commissioned with this new settlement out of Ipswich to go and to initiate at the Brookfield the Quabog plantation. And what they do, now that Pynchon's gone, is essentially they buy out his son John, right? So they either force him or cause him to be able to defer his role inside the council of four, including him that's there, and they start to then take over this area. 1673, they rename it the Brookfield Settlement. 1674, on top of Foster Hill, they commission a minister named Millett. There's a little plaque up there on top of the hill, and they give him 25 acres of land on Foster Hill, which is, I think, where Massasoit's buried, which is what created, I think, the catalyst for all this. So then, at the same time, Massasoit's basically when you say it's the Massachusetts colony, it sounds a lot like it's the land of Massasoit, And it sounds like you're giving a salute to the native, essentially, authority. And so that creates a relationship that Massasoit reciprocates by naming his sons with English names. His first son Alexander he names, his second son Philip he names, with English names. But now you have the company that wants to assert its ability to control the property. And so the Massachusetts Bay Company really looks at saying, okay, now we're going to start to assert our ability to gather and to claim a land that now the court can uphold. The one thing that's interesting in Brookfield, you don't have any bill of sale, even though there's a said to be sold by the Indian, by an Indian, but the Nipmuc Indians, they didn't have any person who was authorized to sell it. They didn't even think that way. So they didn't have anyone who had the authority to sell land. That wasn't even a part of their society. They didn't even have a main chief. They had representative bodies and they had councils. And so the way that they got around that was they basically called the Nipmunks nomadic rather than migratory, and then basically looked and said, hey, who wants to take some money on the side to say you're the chief? Okay? And that's how Brookfield gets settled. Well, that of course creates a problem. So now they end up accusing Massasoit's son, Alexander, executing him. Okay? Now his younger son, right, there's a series of events, but when his younger son initiated King Philip's War, people don't think that Quabog is vulnerable, right? But Quabog at this point is renamed Brookfield, 1673. 1674 is giving away land to a minister, where the dad's likely buried. That's my view anyways. And so 1675, when you follow King Philip's War, it's a trajectory that goes down from Dartmouth right to Brookfield, gains momentum along the way. And what we celebrate as history is we celebrate an event called Wheeler's Surprise, which was, 8 colonials got killed. Well, 3 of those colonials that got killed were 3 of those guys that were in that council. There's only one that survived. Okay, so I offered that the reason why they got killed, or the reason they got attacked, is because those guys had basically sold out the treaty, and they knew it. And so they targeted the Brookfield guys, and they took them out. Okay, so then what happens is that, in history we look at sympathetically, we look at Wheeler's Surprise as the event. That's not the event. They spent 80 Indians trying to destroy Brookfield. They attacked it. They burned down the whole thing. They went on a rampage to burn down everything because of this violation of this treaty was so egregious. And so then what happens is that their center place for organizing their efforts with the Nipmuc and with the Wampanoag, with the Narragansett, and with all the Indians of the area was actually in the place that we call Rutland. That was their military base. And so what they did is they would then organize from that point right there. King Philip's War essentially ends when King Philip is killed, and he's actually betrayed by one of the guys. And so then what happens is that the next 10 years or so, there's a campaign to take the Nipmuc, whether they were favorable toward the colonists, and there are many that were, whether they were praying Indians, and there were many that were, there was 19 praying villages, or whether they were, ambivalent, they got included in basically a category of being a military opponent. And at that point, you can now sell military opponents in slavery. And so the Nipmucs became a resource, a motivated resource, to then initiate the slave trade in Massachusetts. And the way that people then profited was actually to create a conflict, then initiate a resolve by conquering, and then taking those conquered individuals and then removing them into slavery. And in this case, the Indians didn't make very good local slaves, so they sent them down the Caribbean and exchanged them for African slaves. And now the African slave trade started to become a commercial entity. Some would say it was the most important commercial entity in Massachusetts at the time of the Revolution. And again, you can study that inside of documented history. We know that. Okay? So what then happens is that in 1686, about this time that you're having the colonials on the coast wanting to get away from England, is somebody gets the bright idea of let's go west, right? And so Brookfield gets resettled in 1686. That becomes basically from people that joined together with the Sailor Group in what's called the Elm Hill Farm. So if you know Brookfield area at all, there's a new settlement that then formed the town of Brookfield. And then Rutland follows shortly afterwards, right? Now Rutland, what's interesting in all the books on Rutland's history is they all say the same thing, okay? They all say that there's these 5 or 6 Indians that sold the land. The problem is none of them are Nipmuc, right? They're Natick, right? So they're Massachusetts and they don't have any authority to sell land, right? So what you have is you have basically the use of Indians to make a sale. And the second thing that's consistent in all the books is that, well, there's no documents, but there's a court case later on establishing that we have a right to land. This is exactly the same thing that Brookfield did, right? So at that time, what happened is that the use of the court, by virtue of having a company that could claim a right inside the court, then gave a legal, essentially supportable process. Again, you've usurped the king, now you have a local court that is acting as the authority to allow for that land grant to have standing. And so it's the Massachusetts Bay Colony that actually then initiates the process of Massachusetts, or the extension of the Massachusetts Company, extending itself for the fur, the fish, and the human trade. And the process of the human trade was to capture the Indians, which went on through not just the Peacock War, but then afterwards through King Philip's War, to be able to initiate this economy that would supplement your farming, fishing, and hunting with actual human trafficking. And so when we look at Massachusetts history, people obviously, like today, we look at saying, well, everyone should be aghast at that, right? And to be honest, everyone should be, right? We should look and say, wait a minute here, if the world is changing, and we want to have credibility in the process of it changing, the first thing you have to do is be honest about actually what really happened. So otherwise, as soon as you look at that issue and you say, wait a minute here, that didn't happen, well then somebody knows I can't trust you because you're in a plausible denial and likely have an interest in it. So to me, I look and say the reason why history is important to discover is because it also becomes an important way to build and to develop out relationships. So then what happens, and now we're into phase 2 of this talk, right? Once we get through King Philip's War, is now we have this initiation, okay, of things that demonstrate the slave trade. This is one. How we got inoculations was actually a byproduct of a slave deciding that he wanted to be a guinea pig for an inoculation for smallpox. And so he was a slave for Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather in 1621, there was a major smallpox epidemic. That was also motivating migration out to the west. That's also what motivated likely the migration out to Rutland. And so what he does is that he initiates this idea that you could take a little bit of the disease and put it into him and it would make him safe, because that's what they practiced out in the Far East. So this tells you that this slave was not local, okay? That he was brought in from a place that was far, far away, right? Asia, India, where they practiced, in the Middle East, where they practiced a kind of inoculation against disease that ends up becoming our pathway to vaccines and a pathway to essentially eradicating the smallpox epidemic. And so you could say the slave trader, eradicated the smallpox epidemic if you want to, but that becomes something that shows that this dynamic, right, is now an accepted part of society. And so when we look at the foundations of what created, Central Mass, in the midst of all this, you've got the Western influence, you got the Eastern influence, you have the Native influence, and now you have the African influence that are all dynamically working right here. And by the time that Quock Walker is born in 1753, the slave industry is booming, not just on the coast, but it's booming. And I would offer that one of the motives, right, that emerged was the ability to take slaves and to not just have to ship them in, because that would be costly, right? Even though there's a lot of other things that were being developed through the slave trade. You could trade your own goods if you have a ship that's motivated with a bunch of people that they're trafficking, right? But that the things that developed alongside this was the idea of breeding the slaves. So now, purchasing a slave for the sake of the process of making slaves was also a motivated industry. And that becomes why the Quock Walker story becomes so both fascinating, sad, and convicting. Is because the Quock Walker story, as much as it talks about the eradication of slavery, also looks at the process of breeding slaves for the sake of profit. And when you look at and you examine this case, what happens is that 1781, Quock Walker runs away. By this point, the Constitution is going to validate his ability to be a free man. His master chases him. Well, why does he have the right to chase him? In 1763, the guy who purchased Quock Walker's parents, James Caldwell, he dies. But he had promised Quock Walker he would have his freedom when he turned 25. So Mingo and Diana have a child. They get 25 years of service, and then they give you freedom, which sounds gracious. Now, indentured servitude was a 7-year contract for most of the Irish that were part of it. That was a much better deal for people, right? If you have 25 years or 20 years or 15 years of good labor, that was a motivated incentive. But also, the ability to actually create a slave by breeding slaves was a profit incentive. And so when you look at this whole thing, right, what's happening is that the incentive alongside of the difficulty in farming or the difficulty in fishing and hunting, right, is emerging that there's a motivation in human trafficking that now is central to Massachusetts. And so then you have this case that emerges at this time because the Constitution initiates this one line. All men are born free, and the first draft was free and independent, free and equal. Okay? So that becomes the line, the compelling line that allowed Quock Walker his freedom. But his story is, what happens is that 1781 he runs away from his master, who was married to Caldwell's wife. So Caldwell dies in 1763 after he bought Walker's parents, after he promised Quock Walker his freedom. And then in 1769, his former wife, marries a guy named Jennison. Okay, now Jennison also promises his freedom to Quock Walker when he turns 21. They reduced it from 25 to 21. So that would be 1778. So then, 1778 would be when he was turning 25. So 1774 would be when he turned 21. So what happens is that the wife of James Caldwell passes away in 1772. Jennison now has ownership of Quock Walker and all of his siblings. He has 6 siblings who are all born and died prior to it becoming buried. But it's still not buried yet at this point, right? So they're all, part of this family that were essentially promised their freedom. So they had this on their mind. Caldwell had died in 1763 because he and Mingo were out by a tree, and the tree got hit by lightning, and it came over and crashed, and then it then killed James Caldwell, broke the legs of Mingo, who eventually then ran away and was then brought back underneath the fugitive slave law. So what you have is that you have this idea that the African product was valuable, not just for the work that it produced, but actually for the ability to produce human children as labor. So then you have this event that takes place in Massachusetts, emerging right, called the American Revolution. And Rutland becomes a big part of this, right? Rutland has in his history books right here, we sent so many people to Lexington and Concord, and we had so many people at Bunker Hill, and we had, this. But what the Revolutionary War really was it was preceded by a series of events that motivated all those things that we celebrate in history, but that actually inform this process much better. To understand that, you have to go back into the motivations of guys like Washington, who had an interest in the Ohio Territory in 1748, which was beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Yeah, so what happened in 1763, after the French and Indian War, is that King George created the first Indian reservation from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. And the Northwest Territory was all part of that. And basically it was off limits to the colonials. The colonials had a group that was developed in Central Mass of rangers. Rangers were people who were taught how to fight by the Nipmuc Indians in 1675. They actually taught the colonials how to fight. They helped the colonials create the Rangers, which is the basis of the largest military in the world. And I'm a lacrosse coach. They actually used lacrosse as their method of training, and so they codified it up at Fort Edward, which is on the Hudson River. And then that created the foundations for Rogers Rangers, who's credited for taking those codes and putting them into a document form and putting them into a way to then perpetuate that. By the time the Revolution hits, there's scores of ranger groups. You go to Waltham, you see all these different ranger groups, and those are like an elite fighting force, just like today, right? The Rangers go in, like the Marines go in. Marines have a ground unit, that's the Navy. The Marines go in, and that's the attack unit. Same thing with Rangers. That elite fighting force was founded by the Nipmuc Indians. So the most important military in world history has its origin there. And then the Nipmucs were sold into slavery, killed, or basically, moved up. That was the contribution to the people that founded our military. Okay. So when we look at this, right, what I'm getting to is the motivation for money was driving all of these issues above anything else. The motivation for profit above anything else, above conscience. Okay. George Washington is credited as being a father of the country, but George Washington had an interest in the Ohio Territory, which then gets really lived out in Rutland through Rufus Putnam, who was really journeyman in New Braintree as an engineer. Then he was given essentially a land grant after the French and Indian War in Brookfield, where he lived for 22 years. Rufus Putnam had been part of the Fort Edward group when Fort William Henry was attacked. If you know your French and Indian War history at all, that group, if you ever saw Last of the Mohicans, that group got so mad about not supporting Fort William Henry that they actually abandoned the British. And so Rufus Putnam was part of the group that actually abandoned his post. They came back, they had a real rough time coming back. They had to eat a dog and have all sorts of different difficulties to get back home. So that was one strike against him. The second strike is that he actually abdicated his post because he had an affair with somebody in Brookfield named Betsy Ayres, who was a founding family. They had a child. She dies of childbirth. And what's funny is that in North Brookfield's church history, you have this guy named Eli Forbes, who's the first minister there, and you have all these people that are coming up confessing to fornication, right, in the church. So you have this history of all these people, and you wonder, why in the world would they do this? Well, Rufus Putnam never confessed to anything. And so I imagine that Eli Forbes was looking and saying, all right, well, I got to do another sermon today on David and Bathsheba or something, And so you have this relatively comical series of events. Well, Eli Forbes gets basically ousted when John Murray gets ousted from Rutland, and their homes get taken over and basically confiscated for the use of the colonial purpose. And this is the pattern that Rufus Putnam then goes out into Marietta, Ohio. He's the ideal candidate to be a guy for Washington to use underneath the Ohio Company and Associates to steal the land from the Indians. So that's Rufus Putnam in truth. And telling the library about the story is why I'm here today. So that's why they invited me. But once you understand that, okay, now you understand that there's inside of the colonial movement, there's two kinds of movements going on. There's one that are trying to capitalize on it, and there's one that are trying to liberate it. Okay? And this tension is created. The town of Barry originates its name as the town of Hutchinson, which, if you can imagine, now you have Quack being born in Hutchinson, which is the governor of Massachusetts, who gets ousted, along with Timothy Ruggles, along with 300 other Massachusetts officials. That's where really your revolution begins, right? So what happens is that Rufus, you've got Ruggles, and you got this event that's ousting Eli Forbes and all these kinds of officials, Murray, and to confiscate their land. Well, then Hutchinson, who also got ousted, Hutchinson gets renamed Barry. Does anybody know who Barry is, by chance? Well, Eric Barry is actually he's not an American. He's an Irish parliamentarian. Yeah. He's in Ireland, and the reason why he's in England, he's a parliamentarian. The reason why he's selected is because he brands the name the Sons of Liberty. And so what happens is that he becomes somebody that the people here looked at and they felt recognized by. He would advocate the policies of a guy named William Pitt, where Pittsburgh's named after, would also advocate the American solution and the American right for independence. So this is going on in Parliament. At the same time, the people in Barry look and say, hey, we don't want to be Hutchinson, we want to be Barry, we want to be tied to the Sons of Liberty, and the Sons of Liberty are trying to perpetuate this idea of freedom. And so what you have is you have a philosophical collide that's going on, as well as an economical collide. And that economical collide is tied to the slave trade. And so as you create this revolution, right, you have land and you have slaves that are motivating it. And so one group is looking and saying, okay, once we get rid of England, right, how do we profit? How do we benefit from that? How do we take this over, and how do we essentially sustain it underneath a new heading? And then you have another group that says, wait a minute here, we're fighting for a new world. We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for something different, right? Now, what becomes interesting is that, Pynchon, who got, his book burned and was basically banned and was tossed out, he has a son named John, who has a son named John, who has a son named John, who has a daughter named Mary. Okay? Now, Mary Pynchon marries a guy named Joseph Dwight. Okay, Joseph Dwight's a general in the French and Indian War, and he's a guy who ends up, after his wife dies in 1751, his son-in-law, Jedediah Foster, moves into their house on Foster Hill, which is where the Brookfield settlement was. So what you know is that land grant all the way extends down to that family, to the Pynchons, to the Dwights, to Jedediah Foster. Okay, and so when you look at the events that then created Jedediah Foster's writing of the Constitution, right, which is, again, credited to John Adams, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but writing of the Constitution, you have a very, very interesting series of events that's happening. And what happens is that this taking over of this Western territory, right, by the Central Mass colonials, who incidentally are also tied with the guys in Vermont, so the Green Mountain Boys and all those guys, those guys, the Green Mountain Boys and Central Mass are kind of like joined together at the hip, right? And they're wanting to go west. So when they take over a fort at the top of Michigan that the Indians used, kind of like a Switzerland, called Fort Michilimackinac, right? This fort was a significant, essentially core place because it really guarded the passageway into Western expansion. And this fort then becomes the place that controls the Western trade. So it's right at the top of Michigan, it's right between the UP, and so it controls all the ships going through. So Fort Michilimackinac was actually taken over by the Indians using the game of lacrosse in Pontiac's War as a part of the campaign. And afterwards, when they named this whole area basically an Indian reservation, what they do, the British send up the Rangers, Rogers Rangers, up to Fort Michilimackinac. And they then become the guards at Fort Michilimackinac. Well, then the British decide, hey, we don't really want the colonials controlling the Western expansion, so we're going to remove them. So right around 1765, they decommission that, they make it a new fort, they send in the British regulars to now garrison Fort Mackinac, or Fort Mackinac, I think is what it is. Okay, so then they sent Rogers Rangers home, okay, to the chagrin of Central Mass. So now Central Mass saying, wait a minute here, now they're basically taking away our ability to go out west. They're cutting us off. So this is now breeding resentment. Okay, when you look at the slave trade, you got to ask yourself, how is the slave trade managed? Okay, how is it that people manage the slave trade seemingly so seamlessly? Okay, and so one of the things that you have is that there's a card game called Slave Trades. And we can actually play cards, and in the process of playing cards, we can actually make the trades. Okay, you can warm it up, or you can have it be real. Okay, but the process of trading cards over tea or over event gives us a chance to be able to then negotiate that contract. Okay, the ability to control the cards, right, and to control the trade has to do with then notarizing the documents. So whether you notarize cards or then you notarize the contract, you have to notarize the contract in the slave trade. So that slave trade was then managed by the Stamp Act. And the reason why there is such a reaction to the Stamp Act is because that would actually control the slave trade, notarized documents that would then be controlled by the British rather than be able to be organized by the colonials. So you have the land and you have the humans, industries being cut off. Now the people in Central Mass are looking to say, wait a minute here, right? You're cutting us off at the knees. So what they do is you have a series of events. Most of them have to do with economical negotiations, the Intolerable Acts. They basically now start to represent, hey, we can be free. They already have the concept of being free because they have their own court, they have their own companies have standing in court, that gives them property rights, and basically that creates the legal protection for the interest. So then what you have is you have now the motivation for people to rebel against the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act gets credited, and this all gets credited as being the thing that was trying to pay for the war, and maybe that's the case. But really what you had is you had the industries that people were being used to that were being undermined in this process, and so they were mad about this. So what happens is that in Sheffield, right, Massachusetts, there's a group that meets at a guy named John Ashley's house, okay, and a guy named Sedgwick drafts this resolve called the Sheffield Resolves and reads it at the house in 1773. Okay, those resolves basically say, okay, mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other, and have the right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and property. Okay. Now, Thomas Jefferson later on would take a similar approach in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So these are declarations, right? And when you look at these, here's a copy. When you look at these declarations, these, from a legal standpoint, basically say, this is who we say we are. But there's no binding contract that can be enforced in courts and can then be serviced with enforcement. A declaration is not a law. A declaration is just a declaration. Okay? So now you have these declarations being made, and then what happens is that because the colonials are believing that the courts are the problem, they start this effort to shut down the courts. So they start to then, in August 16th, 1774, 1,500 men without guns go and close down the Great Barrington Court. Okay, that's out west. Number one, August 23rd, they take over the Rutland, which would be eventually the Rutland Military Barracks, but at that time I believe it was a Rutland prison. I think it was reutilized from the native years. They take over the Rutland prison on August 23rd. On August 24th, they take over John Murray's house. They also take over what would become the Timothy Bigelow house in Worcester. That's Treat Payne's house. So they take over those two on August 24th. Then what they do is they read this commission that basically looks at encouraging the counties of Massachusetts to shut down their courts. So then on August 30th, they shut down Springfield's court. September 6th, 1774, they read the Suffolk Resolves in Massachusetts, Joseph Warren, which really then separates Massachusetts from England. And at the same time, 5,000 men, including all the men in Rutland, go to Worcester, and they close down the Worcester court, making them resign 30 times publicly under the threat of being tarred and feathered. Timothy Ruggles, to make a point with him that he was going to resign, is they actually tarred and feathered his horse. Okay. So what happens is that, and again, this is the Sheffield Resolves, this is the house that they met at. So what happens is that you have this event that now is attacking the courts, and that's really where the revolution starts. Okay? By December of that year, now the colonials, after they shut down all the courts, they declared their independence, now they're at war because in December they attack Fort William and Mary up in New Hampshire. It's the only battle in New Hampshire, and they take over Fort William and Mary, they confiscate 16 guns. That's December 16th, 15th, and 14th, or 13th, 14th, and 15th, 1774. This is before Lexington and Concord. What I'm saying is we're already at war. Okay? And so what Gage does is that Gage wants to go and basically confiscate or reconfiscate the guns that he hears are out of Lexington and Concord. Joseph Warren catches wind, likely from Gage's wife, catches wind that they have this event coming. So Paul Revere, who had gone up to warn, in December, the events that caused for the battle at Fort William and Mary, now he goes out and Paul Revere is credited with going out west. Well, what really happens is that they hear that the regulars who had been at Fort Michilimackinac are being brought back by Gage and commissioned to go out to Lexington and Concord. These are the same regulars that replaced the Rangers. So now Western Mass, who was basically usurped by the regulars, right, they now have a chance to go in and take care of them. So it's kind of crazy to think that a shot heard Lexington and Concord motivates the entire state to be able to get someplace that they can't get to in a day today, right? It's kind of a crazy idea when you really think about that, right, from a historical standpoint. What you had was a group of people that were so motivated against this that they're already in war, and they were going to make sure that these guys that took away their future would pay. So 700 British came out. They would have all been wiped out if they weren't reinforced by 3,000 British that were coming in, and Western Mass rallied in force. They didn't say the British are coming, they said the regulars are coming. And the only thing that was going to happen that day is that the British were going to be killed, because Western Mass was moving in force and in unity. Everyone across the whole place was coming. So you now have this event, it gets postured in history as that, we had the Minutemen that, in a day made it out to Lexington and Concord, even though you can't do that now, right? So what you really had these people that were fighting for the expansion westward and fighting for their ability to give a future to their kids, which is really what was at stake at that point. And so when you come into the Quogue Walker case, right, in opposition to that is this trade in human cargo that is motivating, the South to a lot of, to much extent, but it's motivating the economy on the East Coast at the cities more than it is helping Central and Western Mass. And so, Western Mass, they have an expansion mindset. They want to go in, they want to expand into the Northwest Territory, right? The East Coast, they want to keep trafficking in slavery, okay? And that's the tension. And so Quogue Walker then becomes this event, right? That then is preceded by Jedediah Foster writing the Constitution. Now the Constitution, the way that this gets happened is that all the states are told to write a Constitution. Massachusetts becomes last. John Adams is actually over in France trying to negotiate the deals with France. Comes back for this period of time, and what he likely does is he commissions Jedediah Foster and Levi Lincoln to go on to write the Massachusetts Constitution. And then Jedediah Foster, likely, in my opinion, gets killed in the midst of it while he's doing it. Assassinated with typhoid or assassinated with some kind of poison. And then they take that document and John Adams basically puts his stamp of approval upon it, and then it forces it into law books. So we see the Massachusetts Constitution today, okay, and what we see is this elegant document that was created that was a binding law at the time. And so all men are born free and equal. Independent was the first draft. And have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberty, that of acquiring, possessing, protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. All men are born free and equal. Powerful statement that's written and codified into law, right? Now what happens later on when they write the US Constitution, look at the contrast. Congress will make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress and grievance. Okay. When you look at what happened in the two constitutions, I would argue that the group that wanted to maintain slavery utilized the event of Shays' Rebellion and reacted to the Quogue Walker case and the Bitt-Freeman case to be able to then write out of law equality. When you look at it, the bait is, hey, I'll give you religious freedom, but in exchange, you're no longer equal. Okay, so here, that's the thing. When you look at the Constitution and how it's written, that has actually a sample of Jedi Foster's writing from 1752, because Jedi Foster wrote the Constitution for the North Brookfield First Congregational Church, which I would argue likely is the Massachusetts Constitution is argued as the oldest document, the oldest democracy in the world, and the North Brookfield Church is still standing, still going. So I think that probably predates it by 26 years. But when you look at it, what you see that there's this conscience of equality that was written into Massachusetts law, that because everyone else is joining the Massachusetts Revolution, that then becomes binding when applied to a country as a whole. And if you take the Massachusetts Constitution and then you were to apply it to the country, you would have everybody in the same boat as Genesis was, with this case with Quogue Walker. So what happens is that this case becomes one that I think scares the country into writing the new Constitution. And unfortunately, in that process, we choose to perpetuate slavery, and we choose to also perpetuate the use of the military to acquire property for the benefit of the entitled, of which George Washington was a beneficiary. We use it to be able to then perpetuate theft. And this is a case of having done something right and choosing by either, the carrot or convenience or profit to perpetuate something wrong. The story goes on in Massachusetts. It becomes the center point for the abolitionist movement. So even though the Constitution, the writing of this, what was called the Second Constitution, seems like a defeat to equality and freedom, Massachusetts doesn't quit. Good news. It leads to the Civil War. It leads to the most casualty, the war that has the most casualties. It may actually, if you had all of the casualties combined, might not equal the Civil War. Right? It led to that kind of consequence, having chosen to do something wrong when you had it right. So Massachusetts, in writing all men are born free and equal, free and independent, had it right. They had created something that was unique, and they had created something that scared the entitlement to their core. So much so that they had to then figure out how to be able to organize this. Now this is a couple of things. These documents here are sad. One is the Rutland Prison document. It's basically, when you look at the Bathsheba Spooner case, Bathsheba Spooner, is, by the way, the second cousin of John Adams, just for trivia. So if you know the Bathsheba Spooner case, they were family. But Levi Lincoln and Jedediah Foster were involved in the Bathsheba Spooner case. Levi Lincoln was the defense attorney for Bathsheba Spooner, claimed she was insane, which means that she doesn't have a voice in court now, so she can't defend herself. Okay. Jedediah Foster is on the 4-person panel that condemns Bathsheba Spooner to death. So a year later, what you see is Jedi Foster's daughter dies mysteriously right at the same time that Bathsheba Spooner was hung, 1779. And then shortly after that, Jedi Foster dies on October 17th, 1779, 2 years after the Battle of Saratoga was won, in the middle of when he's writing the Constitution. There's a lot of drama here, okay? Obviously, you can't talk about all that in the midst of trying to be able to establish that all men are born free and independent. So my view is that John Adams basically said, okay, I'm going to use my influence to put this draft forward, and I'm going to claim it's my own. And while I can say, okay, you know, he was a plagiarist, probably for practical reasons. He was involved here only a short period of time. He was here August 3rd till November 1st. There's no way he could have written that. He's engaged in trying to negotiate peace with France. This is the document that basically founds democracy in the world. He did not have time to do this. It's as practical thinking that as you're thinking that people get to Lexington and Concord in a day after the hero shot around the world. You know, I mean, it's fiction. So what you have practically is you have somebody who was, and here's the interesting thing, somebody who was the brother-in-law to the guy who wrote the Sheffield Resolves. Jedediah Foster and Sedgwick were family. They were married to the same girls, right? Pamela Dwight and Dorothy Dwight. Dorothy Dwight was Joseph Dwight's daughter out in Brookfield. Pamela Dwight was Joseph Dwight's daughter out in Great Barrington. And so Sedgwick becomes the writer of the Sheffield Resolves, and then he becomes the person who defends Mama Bet Freeman. He becomes the attorney that actually sues the host of the party for the Sheffield Resolves, John Ashley, right, to then create the case that allows for the standing to be heard of the Constitution. Now, I would imagine that what you have is the real influencers in all this are likely the women in the kitchen talking to Mama Bet and saying, you know, you can be free and your kids can be free because the law says so. She heard the Sheffield Resolve, she heard the Declaration of Independence, but they would have talked to her and said, in order for freedom to stand, you have to have it codified in law. And therefore, the Constitution has to be given standing. Later on, she basically files a case, right, against John Ashley, and then they grant her standing as a free person by nature of the word of law. All men are born free and equal. That tested the law. And so then what happened, right about the same time, the Quock Walker case comes up. And now Quock Walker, I think, has a different motive. I think Quock Walker is not just concerned about himself, but he's also concerned about his siblings and his children. Because while he was promised freedom by his owner in an indentured relationship, one that could have standing, nonetheless, he still was concerned about everybody else. And so what he does is that he leaves the house in April of 1781. He leaves Jennison's house, okay, knowing that he is likely going to take a beating. And so he goes to Caldwell Brothers' house and he starts working there, almost baiting him to a fight. Okay? And sure enough, Jennison comes, give me my son back, give me my slave back. Here's a story if you want to follow it as well. Give me my slave back. He says no. He was promised his freedom. He was promised his freedom. He's well over 20, he's 28 years old. He's free now. He's done his time. So Jennison comes back with a bunch of guys and they beat Quock Walker. They take him and they put him into prison. And Quock Walker initiates a suit on battery. Goes into the court and at the lower court level initiates this argument that he was promised his freedom, that natural law recognizes men as free. And he goes into this whole, basically, Levi Lincoln is his defense attorney, goes and basically then initiates this concept that he is able to be awarded freedom based upon the previous contract. The jurors say, yes, you're free. They award him 50 pounds of silver, okay, from Jennison. Just, right? Well then, Jennison initiates a lawsuit, and the court there also finds for Jennison that Caldwell's had enticed Quock Walker to run away, so now you have a fugitive slave issue. And so they also then award him 25 pounds of silver. Both parties decide to appeal it. So then Jennison's attorneys, they end up not filing in time. Likely they were influenced, maybe strong-armed not to file. Maybe they had other motives, we don't know, because they never filed their appeal. So it was a default judgment. And then Quock Walker was actually found to have been awarded, been unlawfully enslaved. And so his award stood. He would still have 25 or 50 pounds of silver. Okay. Now the Commonwealth of Massachusetts takes up Quock Walker's case, and they initiate a case against Jennison, all right, on the grounds of battery. And this becomes a Supreme Court ruling. And what happens is that you have this event where the people that are involved in the legal system, and this is Cushing, this is the Supreme Court judge who read this opinion, the Supreme Court, the people end up becoming supportive of Jedediah Foster, right? When you look at what happens in history, Levi Lincoln, who seems to have kind of mixed motives in my opinion for why he was doing things, I think he was on more of the profiteering side. Levi Lincoln and Rufus Putnam become founders of Leicester Academy, and Leicester Academy becomes, I think, a perpetuator of a certain kind of version of history, right? Levi Lincoln also becomes a very, very interesting character because he oversees the process of Timothy Ruggles being imprisoned, Timothy Bigelow being imprisoned for poverty, and goes through 6 weeks of being impoverished in prison before he dies. Again, I think likely assassinated. So you have all these kind of different dubious events that surround Levi Lincoln, right? Over the course of time, he kept on running against Jedediah Foster's sons, never won. Jedediah Foster had 2 sons, and they're the only other sons other than the Kennedy brothers that have ever been senators from one state, right? So the people understood, right? And the courts understood. And so what you had is this event where you now have this chief judge, Cushing, who comes in and he inserts a concept called judicial review. The argument for Quock Walker was initiated by a guy named Payne. He's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But Cushing initiates this essentially statement that is there to demonstrate the court's support of Jedediah Foster's Constitution, which John Adams had credited. Now Cushing is credited through the case of Quock Walker. And so what you have is you have this very, very eloquent, right, as to the doctrine of slavery and the right of Christians to hold Africans in perpetual servitude and sell and treat them as if we do our horses and cattle. That it is time, it is true, has been here heretofore counterhanded by the province laws formally, but nowhere is it expressively enacted or established. Okay, what he's saying is this is a practice that we have now developed, and we've used a model of other places. But he goes on to say, it has been a usage which took its regulations of British government respecting the then colonies for the benefit of trade and wealth. But whatever sentiments have formerly prevailed in this particular or said or slid in upon us by the example of others, a different idea has taken place with the people of America, more favorable to the natural rights of mankind. And it goes on to say, and to that natural innate desire of liberty, with which heaven, without regard to color, complexion, or shape of nose features, has inspired all the human race, and upon this ground our constitution of government, by which the people of this Commonwealth have solemnly bound themselves, sets out with declaring that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject is entitled to liberty, and to have it guarded by the laws as well as life and property. And in short, it is totally repugnant to the idea of being born slaves. This being the case, I think the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and constitution, and therefore can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature unless his liberty is forfeited by some criminal conduct or given up by personal consent or contract. He comes in strong behind the words that are codified into law, all men are born free and equal, which I would argue cost the writer his life. Cost the writer his life. May have cost his sister-in-law her life. We see Sedgwick's wife, Pamela, formerly Pamela Dwight, later on is credited for committing suicide with poison. And what you see a lot of times with the presidents of those that were involved in the Northwest Territory is you see this common, essentially symptomatic excuse. William Henry Harrison dies from getting a cold. That looks like typhoid. Jedediah Foster dies from who knows what. Looks like typhoid. The second minister at North Brookfield's Congregational Church dies from who knows what. Looks like typhoid, right? Zachary Taylor dies from eating too many cherries. Again, looks like typhoid. What you see is you see this frequency between all the presidents that were involved in the Northwest Territory that would die every 10 years. The time before that period, you'd see presidents die in office every 20 years. And the times after that period, the same. So you see this influx of suspicious deaths that, in my view, are likely assassinations using biological warfare in a very strategic manner, developed inside of institutions that could take slaves and experiment on them, and then on the positive side, come up with great antidotes, and on the negative side, come up with nefarious tools. So, what do we got when we come to the end of this? Right, Quock Walker is set free, right? And there's a initiation for, in this state, actually a Quock Walker Day. And wouldn't it be great if, the town of Rutland was, as being the birth site, actually the perpetuator and the encourager of that process. And that was just recently. They're now discovering the story of Quock Walker. Wouldn't it be great if the town of Rutland was able to be the host site for Quacku's Passage, the new version of Sam Pickens' play that was founded on the work of Lawrence Pickens over the course of many, many years. All right. So when you look at the story of Quock Walker, there's things to see. His sisters and brothers you see later on, having long lives, having kids, having families. Right. In 1784, I found that Quock Walker was said to have bought a parcel of land for 10 pounds, although I'm not sure if that's accurate, but at least one source said. Settled in Barry, married Elizabeth Harvey in 1786. Right, 1790, he's identified being in Barry with 3 other women living inside of a house. In 1800, we see his records missing. All right, in 1812, Elizabeth sold the land that was purchased by Quock Walker to William Robinson of Barry, and then 1830 she dies. Okay? So we see a relatively normal life given and lived out by Quock Walker, and even though there's things that obviously were difficult from a historic standpoint, right? And today's Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is maybe appropriate for this conversation and this topic. And one of the things that I've discovered by being involved with kids in Africa now is that a lot of the things that seem to have been difficult 200 years ago in communication are also the same today, and that there's a way to bridge that with relationships, that there's a way to have a community that take a little bit extra time to learn how to communicate in unique ways that are unique to the cultures. If they understand that cultures have different ways of communicating, that then they can, through that time, they can go a long way to bridge that. In that light, what's fun and what's ironic is that there's a parish called the Tri-Parish, right, which is a parish in Hardwick that has 4 facilities, 4 buildings, and the Calvinist church is now the host site for, the pews are filled with donated lacrosse gear that's being organized in the pews to go to Africa, East Africa, to quite literally what was identified in 2016 as the third poorest economy in the world. And we have about 100 now developing youth academies with kids who are taking this sport used by the Nipmunks to train the U.S. military, to now then perpetuate training academies that can then invite relationships just through the exchange of equipment, taking a skill that's here in America, built by the natives, amplified in the highest academic institutions. Lacrosse is an elite sport for sure, and so now to be able to give that to one of the poorest places in the world becomes kind of fitting. It becomes something that's beautiful. So the tri-parish is one of the places that's not being used. Actually, it's right now filled. All the seats are filled with gear that's being organized. And if people want to have something that looks at it and is tied to the gear, there's a card there my mom has. You can dial in on the card and see some of the pictures of the kids that are involved in developing that. About 3 weeks ago, we had the first scholarship athlete in lacrosse history from Africa come and stay with us. He's now at Westcliff University. His name's George Ojic. Ojic means, I was the last child born. So he is now the first child of what we can maybe hope is possible to create a new world. And what I think is kind of beautiful and fitting is that there's I call them several little old ladies who came up and were allowing us to use this facility that have become encouraged and excited to help to build this project. And so it seems fitting that that in the process of equality, that what you have is that you have a culture and a community wrap themselves around a relationship and reach out across the world. There's a guy named Friedman who wrote a book in 2005 called The World is Flat, and he looked at the future economy. And what he said is, there's three elements to the future economy. Okay, the local value, outsourcing, relationships with the world, and technology. And we have all three of those things coming together through all this right now. Before I close, the last thing I'll do is pitch next weekend. It seems entirely fitting that there's an event here that draws the community together. That seems to be a good follow-up, and to create a great potential for Rutland and for what it will be, and what it will be not just inside the local area, but inside the world, inside the world's eyes. And in closing, on Jedediah Foster's tombstone, which you can find in West Brookfield, there's the word "sic vinci gloria mundi." Thus passes the glory of the world. Thank you.
When they swapped the
I guess questions are probably appropriate right now.
when they swapped the Indians for the Africans, did they send whole Indian families, or just like the ones that looked like good workers?
They took them all. So what they did is they took the Indians, they put them out to Deer Island, where a lot of them died, and then they shipped them all because they were productive as well as for breeding as well as for work. Right? And that's probably what we understand.
Why would they take the Indians if the Africans were better workers?
So the Indians
What
would
was
not.
in it for them?
So the Indians gave them something to exchange. They would work down there because they were taken outside of their home. And when they're taken outside of their home, they're vulnerable. Basically, you work or you die. So they would take the Indians from here because they would just run away here. They bring them down the Caribbean, and they would change for the Africans there, and that created the triangular trade.
You need to rename this talk. It's way more interesting than the title leads it to believe.
Hopefully less.
I saw lawsuits and I'm going like,
Yeah, you came anyways,
but
right?
boy, was I fascinated.
Again, thank you. And if there's any questions, I think that there is time. Yes, go ahead.
Levi Lincoln, who was the lawyer for the court, is he the same guy who was governor and then
Yes.
U.S. representative?
Yeah, he ended up being advantaged quite a bit. And again, I think Levi Lincoln may be somebody who had, because of the Bathsheba Spooner case when he was young, And because of this, they needed to get rid of her. She was really silenced her, right, from a legal standpoint. So I think that they had something that could motivate Levi Lincoln to become, used by some of the powers to be.
Why was that Bessie Spooner? Why was she hung? I never.
So what I think was because she was involved in espionage. What you hear is that she was involved in killing her husband, right? Because she was a despondent wife. But I don't think that's the case. I think she was involved in espionage, and I think that there are others that were involved. Peg Shipman with Benedict Arnold, Gage's wife.
Okay.
So I think that's where it was really happening.
Thank you.
Bye now, nice to see you all.
Any other questions?